Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to bring you my 11.2 Season 3 Raid Healer Tier List Race to World First Edition. Today, I want to break down all the healers and my predictions for where they're going to be in terms of Race to World First representation, since all healers are in a competitive spot for cutting-edge teams, even like top 50 world teams. But Race to World First is where you really see the specs and those slight advantages come forward. So if you're enjoying this content, be sure to like and subscribe, as we're also working on our 100,000 subscriber goal before the end of the year. Starting it off, we have our Race to World First stackable tier, and there is only one healer on this one, and it is Mistweaver. This should really not be too much of a surprise, especially if you watch the last race for Liberation of Undermine. Monk does a considerable amount of passive damage, which is always a huge factor for things in the Race to World First. They bring the Mystic Touch debuff onto enemies, which doesn't look like at the time of this video that the other two Monk specs are going to be brought into something like Race to World First. They bring fantastic passive damage that they're naturally doing while putting out their healing rotation. In Race to World First in Liberation of Undermine, it was predominantly in an Ancient Teachings of the Monastery style, but it looks like the optimal HPS is headed towards more of a rushing wind kick type Yu'lon setup. That being said, there might be some encounters where they can get away with running the Ancient Teaching setup, doing a little bit more damage instead. We saw in the last season how they were using like Jade Empowerment for more crackling Jade Lightning damage because it did a lot of prio target at the time. Now they've then changed it so it's more about even cleave damage. There could be some encounters with a lot of adds that could be a relevant factor for. That being said, when it comes to healers that can deal very reliable, continuous damage, have very high mobility, very high defensive strengths, all of those are huge pluses for the Race to World First, and Monk's output has been pretty high throughout all of the raid testing we did. They did suffer a couple of nerfs and a little bit of like rebalancing. They've had nerfs towards their Conduit of the Celestials tier set bonus, which was giving you haste off of your Thunder Focus Tea, which you could then further stack with things like Secret Infusion. They nerfed that, I think, from 15% additional haste to 10%, but it's still a very high output spec, both for healing and for damage. The way the spec has been going for pretty much this whole expansion has been making it in a really strong position for Race to World First healing, and I only think that's going to continue as we go into Manaforge Omega. The next thing that we want to make sure we focus on is, of course, our new apparel shop, as we have some brand new shirts, mugs, beanies, all that great stuff. Starting off with some Holy and Disc Priest. If you want to check it out, some new apparel, get some shirts or mugs or anything like that, I would appreciate it, and we're going to be looking to add some more for other specs in the future. The third thing we're going to talk about is the next tier. It's going to be the Race to World First lock specs. Those that I think are going to be locked in, but probably not stacked. Preservation Evoker is going to lead the charge onto this one. Keep in mind, throughout PTR raid testing, they didn't do any retests. They rescheduled some tests, and once they were completed, once you tested all the bosses one time on Heroic, one time on Mythic, they stopped testing and it was over. So what happened with Preservation throughout raid testing was the first round of testing, they were playing Flame Shaper, and their Consume Flame from their Engulf, where they basically hit an Engulf on a Dream Breath target and then they explode for healing, that wasn't doing as much healing as it was supposed to. But the tier set bonus was doing an insane amount. The 4 set for Flame Shaper Evoker causes Essence Bombs to spawn whenever the Evoker gains Essence Burst. And as you might imagine, you gain a lot of Essence Burst after you engulf, so it was doing crazy amounts of healing. They cut that tier set bonus in half, but at the same time, they fixed some of the negative bugs that were making Consume Flame do less healing. So the spec absolutely blasts, and it very much shines in environments where you can stack for healing, just like we saw out of Nerebar Palace. Nerebar Palace actually was featuring double Flame Shaper Evokers because it was doing way more than everybody else. It's like 10 or 20% more healing than everybody else at the time. I don't think we're going to be that dominant going into Manaforge Omega, but it does look to be like the more competitive of the ramp healers. And what we've seen from raid testing has been a number of areas where you can have the raid stacked or mostly stacked to benefit from Flame Shaper's more stacked healing profile. Some potential downsides, though, is that we don't know exactly what Dimensius is going to be bringing to us. You can see the room itself from some of like the pages on Wowhead, and you can look at the arena and how big it is. There's even a section where you're going to have players flying up into the air, sort of like a Tindril phase. Those things exist, but we don't necessarily know if it's going to mean that all of the damage mechanics are going to be spread, or if whole raid is going to be spread during all that damage. We've seen a number of fights in Nerebar Palace, for example, where the raid was spread a lot. I mean, even on areas for Queen Anzarek or for Nexus Princess Kaiveza, there was a few different areas where everyone was pretty spread out, but there were also enough areas that you could time the ramps for preservation when players were stacked or close enough together. So until I see evidence that you're going to have all these players spread out all over the place for sure, and you're going to need to have a better spread healing ramp the way that Discipline Priest does, I think preservation is going to be a Race to World first lock, and the tier set bonus heavily focusing people on being stacked is going to make it worthwhile to position preservation cooldowns for those moments where you can stack, and then some of the other healers, like our other healer in Resto Druid, can make up for it when players are a little bit more spread, because I think Resto Druid is also on this Race to World first lock tier. They are overall just a super strong healer. Output has been very, very good. We saw that as well in Liberation of Undermine, and their Keeper of the Grove tier set bonus is producing some like Dryad that gives you some mini tranquilities and pretty much just juices up what you do already. It's not anything crazy or fancy, but the spec doesn't really need to be. You know, Trank's still a strong cooldown. Convoke, Flourish, all that good stuff is still strong cooldowns. So people were playing around with Wildstalker Druid throughout some of the PTR testing, but it looks like Keeper is the preferred option going into the next raid, and raid buffs are insanely important for Race to World first. We did have some fights in Liberation of Undermine where you wanted to stack Boomkins even, like Styx Bunkjunker, but as you started getting into some of those single target fights later on in the raid, the Boomkins naturally disappeared. And so our Druid, as just a rock solid overall healer, brings the reliable Mark of the Wild buff. From what I've seen, you know, sandbagging in mind, I haven't seen anything that's really gonna encourage any of the other Druid specs to be featured in Race to World first. So I think unless something changes to those DPS specs, especially, Resto Druid is going to be a Race to World first lock. Next up, we have some healers that are in the possible tier. These are healers that I think are brought as like the fourth healer to sort of round everything out, but they are the most vulnerable to getting dropped for a raid buff, for a spec that has slightly better output, for a spec that feels a little bit better on the fight, something along those lines. The top of this list is Holy Priest. Now Holy, with the tier set bonus for Oracle, is going to cast a lot more Prayer of Mending, which also results in a lot more priority target healing, which is always a nice strength for the spec. They're not focused on this pure single target nature the way they were in Nerebar Palace or Shadowlands Season 4, but they do pretty good spot healing on a regular basis, and bring a lot of very powerful cooldowns to the table with Divine Hymn, and of course, the way that Race to World first teams love to coordinate their personals, Symbol of Hope to reduce 30 seconds off of every player's personal is always a very good pick in that sort of race environment. There's a lot more emphasis in the game today on personal defensive usage and coordinating that personal defensive usage to a T. And you get a lot of value out of things like Symbol when you know that if you hit it at the right time, everybody gets a bonus cast of their personal defensive, which allows you to sort of smooth through some of the bursty damage events that a Race to World first is going to bring. Furthermore, Holy Priest, while it doesn't have great mobility and doesn't have great defensives themselves, they do bring a cheat death to the table, which is always super helpful for a Race to World first environment, because you're not going to be losing pulls or attempts to that healer dying. It's always going to give you into angel form when you die, and based off how much you're healing before the angel expires, that's the health level that you're going to res at. It's a talent called Restitution. Furthermore, Power Infusion's great. Fortitude is great as well. One thing, again, with figuring out which damage dealers are in a good spot or in a bad spot, Shadow's had a lot of ups and downs throughout this PTR, but one thing's for sure, Holy Priest has been super consistently strong throughout the raid tests on a variety of different encounters, and been doing extremely well. And with the additional Prayer of Mendings that you're casting from your tier set with Oracle, that grants you better Apotheosis uptime, which grants you more Holy Words, which allows you to have more instant cast abilities. So you can't move quickly, but you can also do a lot on the move compared to where the spec was even in like Dragonflight as well. So I think there's a very real possibility that Holy Priest is going to be the fourth healer in Race to World first, but like I said, it can be on the bubble. A big benefit for it is it can swap to Disc Priest, which I think is also in the Race to World first possible tier. Now, some healers have very hard to find niches in raids, and others are a little bit more flexible. It's a big reason I think like Mistweaver is in our stackable tier, for example, and Disc Priest is in our possible tier. Disc very much shares a niche with Preservation Evoker when it comes to having a large amount of your healing, your overall healing profile, getting focused into narrow burst windows. That's why people are always referring to them as the ramp healers. And so I think the representation for Disc in Race to World First is going to be pretty dependent on where Preservation is going and where the fights are going to be taking us as well, because Preservation does fantastic output when players are stacked. Disc can do that as well when players are stacked, and the output is very good, but it also is not going to be able to fit as well in terms of a healing profile if a massive amount of its output is in a 1.5-minute window and Preservation's on like the 30-45 seconds or so, being able to fill in those exact same slots. And so if you don't need to have 2 ramp healers, we did have it in Nerebar Palace, for example, but they were both Preservation. If you don't need to have the double ramp healers, then I think that Disc is going to be on the sidelines for a lot of the Race to World First fights. But there is a lot of potential when it comes to Dimensius, since we haven't seen how the boss room is going to work in the actual encounter themselves. We might be in situations where all the raid damage goes out when everyone's on the platform and everyone can stack. We might be in the situations where players are all spread out all over the place or in a couple different pockets of groups or something along those lines. So that's a real opening for the spec to do a lot better. It's also possible that there could be some like slight buffs or tuning changes at the last possible second, but I think that's a little bit more rare. Yes, Disc Priest does bring barrier to the table, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, overall damage reduction cooldowns are not as insane as they used to be. Many of them have gotten nerfs over the years, but also the more personal defensives that players have access to, the more they sort of diminish the value of some of the damage reduction tools that healers are bringing to the table. Which, if you're somebody who doesn't have these DR tools like Barrier, then that might be a positive. And if you're a Disc Priest, that could, of course, be a negative. Right now, if you think about encounters, sort of similar to like Mugsy, right? You can have a decent amount of players stacked into that Barrier, but you're not going to get the entire raid on a consistent basis. Or you might only get, when players are stacking up into like the bomb drops to get value out of Barrier. So it becomes a lot more niche in those environments. And if you're already able to map out a lot of defensive usage, you're not going to have to worry about like, oh, we need to have a personal and a barrier on top of this single point, unless some of the damage is just like absurd for a brief period of time. That, again, often ends up being a little bit more rare. So Disc is in a good position, I would say. It's in a powerful position, but not as insane as it was in Liberation of Undermine. And it's kind of similar to where it was in like Nerevar Palace when it comes to power level. It's not in any bad shape whatsoever, but if somebody operates in a similar niche, a little bit better than them, well, Race to World First is the environment where they're going to shine the most. Also, on top of that, Disc is going to be going in with Oracle once again, and Oracle does decent passive damage, but nowhere near as much as you get out of Mistweaver, and so that factor, even like PI included, is nice, but I don't think you're out DPSing Mistweavers even with that on top of it. So keep that in mind. There's a really good benefit, though, for bringing a Holy Priest because they can always swap the disc, and that gives you some really good flexibility. Resto Shaman starts off our Dark Horse list because there's 2 ways I could see it being played in Race to World First. One of which, the most obvious one, is if the DPS Shaman specs get some nerfs or don't have as good a damage profiles for some of the big priority encounters. That can always happen. But also, they have a little bit of a bubble of unknown around them, which I think is really important to bring up. Farseer had a number of bugs throughout the raid testing, one of which was causing your healing stream totem, I think it was with Farseer specifically, to do a lot more healing than intended, and it wasn't giving a clear picture of the actual output of the spec. Furthermore, it wasn't until I think about halfway through PTR that the Call of the Ancestors for the Farseer hero talent actually started replicating healing into Ascendance and into Cloudburst, which is something it has not done at all since it's ever existed at the beginning of the War Within. It just now is happening going into Season 3. This could be a very interesting addition to the spec to further juice up its output, especially like I mentioned earlier in the video, we haven't ended up seeing an additional round of raid testing after they got through one of everything on Heroic and Mythic except for Dimensius, which means that anytime that there's gameplay changes or new setups coming around, there is always the potential for one of these dark horses to rise, playing a build that we have not seen in a high-end raiding environment, with Farseer really just being second banana to Totemic for the entirety of this expansion until this point. So this is probably the start of the dark horse. I really would love to see our Shaman get represented in something like Race to World First. It did get some representation when it came to the Nexus Princess encounter because it did such a good job on sustained spread healing. And this was something that was featured on the Nexus Princess Kaiveza intermission, where everyone had to just spread out all over the place. That is going to be relevant when it comes to the Demon Hunter encounter. It might be relevant as we're going into the Nexus King encounter, as there's a couple different areas that are sort of like the Princess with high movement, high healing requirements, kind of doubling up together. That is a possibility, and it would be really interesting to see if the spec can kind of break into Race to World First once again. But like I said, it looks like it's going to be in a more niche setup. And finally, to wrap up our list, make sure to like and subscribe. But I also, it's time to talk about the Holy Paladins, okay? I think they're at the bottom of the list in this Dark Horse environment. They have been getting some last buffs in like the 11th hour to try to make Herald of the Sun a little bit stronger, especially when it came to their spenders with things like Eternal Flame. They also made Second Sunrise 100% chance instead of the like 20-25% that it was before. They've added a few buffs for the spec, but Paladin has been struggling for quite a while throughout Race to World First, and it's kind of just degraded over time. So in a lot of cases, Diva Aura has gotten nerfed many times over the years. We talked about it in the M Plus video, where it doesn't even get buffed up like raid cooldowns and 5-mans, but in a World First environment, it's a decent cooldown, but these DRs are just not as powerful as they used to be in the past, and output does matter an insane amount. One big problem with having Flameshaper Evoker paired with Holy Paladin is a bit of a cross-contamination, or a bit of crossing niches and crossing value. Holy Pally has a lot of different environments where they want to be close to the target, or they want targets to be stacked close to them. With Sun's Avatar, it did get nerfed going into Season 3 in favor of buffing some of the spenders, so it's a nice way to take some power out, but at the same time, it still has a good chunk of healing tied to that stacked environment. And if the Flameshaper Evoker is just going to do nuts healing when everyone's stacked anyway, then you're just fighting over healing and everything along those lines, which hurts Holy Paladin, of course, because what happened on Nexus Princess in Season 1, they took the Holy Paladin out, plugged a Resto Shaman in, they had better healing in a spread environment, and they still had more than enough healing to deal with the stacked healing checks that Nexus Princess's portals gave. And as a result, if something very similar is going to be happening in the next race, where the stacked healing is always going to be covered and blasted and almost overhealed through, then you're not going to have as much emphasis for other healers that are doing the predominant level of their healing, or a large amount of their healing in that stacked environment, if you can also bring other healers that are doing really well when players are spread or not as stacked. Paladin, I think, has been in kind of just a struggle position for a while, and I think that's only really going to continue as Race to World First is coming just around the corner. There's, I think, just more than like buffs. I think they need almost a revamp of where their healing comes from, because there's a lot of output that is almost what I would call invisible. You have things like Greater Judgment or Judgment of Light. There's many of them for Paladin that are all just like very small amounts of healing. I even think like the Dawn Lights with Herald of the Sun are very like microscopic amounts of healing that add up over time. But what's really been helpful for Paladin over the years with Race has been its ability to do really powerful spot healing, powerful single target healing, reliable output on those targets that take a ton of damage. And it's getting a little better, but if it's already in an awful position, especially compared to where it's been historically, getting slightly better just isn't enough for it. So I'd really love to see kind of like a number of specs getting some pruning of these like invisible heal abilities or bonus modifiers to actually make your spells do healing. Paladin is one of the first ones on my list without a doubt, and I think that it's also going to hurt them quite a bit when it comes to a world first environment, even though I think guilds are looking at like a Prot Pally or Ret situation to bring the Diva Aura to the table. Bringing Aura Master on top of that just doesn't seem enough at the moment. So let me know what you guys think, and what are your predictions as well for the Race to World First, and what healer comps we might end up seeing. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and big love to our patrons for making all this content possible. If you'd like to join them and get access to new videos, check out our UI or coaching. It'll be linked in the description down below. Thank you for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.